Andy Yen. I'm the founder and CEO of Proton. We're a Swiss-based company that focuses on security and privacy. We're best known for our products, Proton Mail, Proton VPN, but also Proton Drive. And what we do is we provide a more private alternative based in Europe to the services that you might use from tech giants like Google, for example. So many people have used Proton Mail instead of Gmail, things like that. In total, we've been able to welcome around 100 million people who have signed up for accounts, and we've done this all here in Europe.
Andy, how do you view privacy?
Yeah, I think it's very subjective. There's no clear rules. If you look today across the tech industry, what you actually see is a definition that the tech industry uses that maybe isn't aligned with what we as people might naturally expect. So if you look at how most tech companies define privacy, it's one of two things, right? Maybe it's will give you more control over how we use and exploit your data, or Apple's definition, which is nobody can exploit your data except for us. I would say the real definition for many people is probably that no one can exploit your data, period. And that's, of course, what Proton's vision is. I think it's, of course, tricky to achieve this. There's a business balance that also needs to be reached. The definition of privacy keeps getting redefined, and the goalposts have been moving a lot. And that's something that I think is quite risky if we don't pay attention to that.
So as I was saying in the introduction, we're generating so much data on a daily basis. I mean, it's incredible. And we're putting that online, of course. Can we actually say today that privacy still exists? I mean, we've seen revelations from Edward Snowden, all of that, which can lead us to start thinking that maybe it's impossible to have privacy today and that our data will be used as tools by businesses no matter what.
I think there is some of that. And this comes from, an easy way to see this is to compare it to the environmental friendly movement, right? Today, we all know that it's very important to be environmentally friendly. If we don't do it, there's no future for the world. But because that's become so important for consumers, what you now have is the biggest oil companies in the world going out there and talking about their environmental credentials. So you have Shell, BP doing all these green programs. And there's a term for this. It's called greenwashing. It has become very common. And I think because we have a similar phenomenon with privacy, people realizing is very important. Now we have privacy washing. And that's a very, I think, similar concept. And that is what is creating really this false sense of security, right? People get told that it's private, just like you're told that oil and gas is eco-friendly. But is it really? Oftentimes, if you look closely, it really isn't. And I think that's a risk that we have more and more today.
For people who are here today, what would be your advice to help protect one's privacy?
Well, I don't think it's all or nothing. There's kind of a notion that you're private or you're not. And if you're a private person, you stay off of social media, you have no Facebook, you have no Instagram, you're hiding under a rock. And I think that's a false dichotomy. It's really kind of a spectrum. So when you want to talk about protecting privacy, you don't have to be private everywhere in order to be a private person. And that's also human nature, right? There's parts of our lives that we want to share and parts that we don't want to share. So it may seem daunting to take back control of your data. It may seem overwhelming, but actually you can start from very basic things. Maybe it's putting your photos on Proton Drive because it's encrypted, right? Or maybe it's changing one of your services somewhere else. There's many things that you can do, and you don't have to do everything to start to make progress towards this. So don't be overwhelmed by kind of the problem, because if you see it from the outside, it seems really scary, but actually you can do it incrementally. I think it's very important to read terms and conditions, but terms and conditions in a legal contract, it's about informed consent, right? And number one, I would say most consumers are not informed because no one actually reads, the terms and conditions. But secondly, is there really the notion of consent? If you want to buy today a phone, a mobile device, you have two choices, either Apple or an Android-based device. And if you want to have a phone, you either have to agree to Apple or Google's terms and conditions. Is that really, consent? Do you really have a choice? I would say probably not.
And that's another conversation, but it's fascinating. The architecture of choice and how you also push people in the end to make a choice by default, right? Actually, we have a question coming in. Is that okay if I take questions as we go? One question, we were talking about anonymization. The person says, so it's anonymous, unfortunately, but the person says, what about data brokers that literally sell data to large amount of people and that can be de-anonymized relatively simply? Does someone want to take this? It's perhaps a technical question, but.
Yeah, I think the person that asked the question is correct. In fact, if you are to collect a bunch of anonymous data sets and run rigorous analysis on it, maybe even using AI in the future, you find that they aren't actually anonymous. But what I would add to this is there's a difference between privacy and anonymity, right? One is something that's protected by law, and another one is actually really a lifestyle choice. If you want to live an anonymous life, that's actually very difficult to do. So people often equate the two concepts, but they're actually very different. And I think in life, we can have a reasonable expectation for privacy, but probably not a reasonable expectation to be anonymous.
How important is regulation, and can privacy laws keep up with the pace, with the technological change?
Yeah, I might take a different tact on this particular question, because it's a very interesting one. If you look at GDPR, it was successful in the sense that it set a new global standard. But if you were to talk to the people at the European Commission that made the GDPR and ask them, do you think it succeeded? Did it achieve the vision you had for it? They probably wouldn't say it publicly, but in privately, they might tell you, not quite. And I think this goes back to a very important principle, which is I don't believe we can really solve the privacy problem without first attacking the competition issue. And I'll give you a very good example. Let's say you don't like, I'll pick Facebook, because it's a very easy one to pick on for privacy issues, right? Let's say you don't like Facebook's privacy policies. What choice do you have? You could always ditch Facebook for TikTok, which of course is probably worse than based in China, right? And I think that illustrates very fundamentally the problem here. Because there are not more choices on the marketplace, there isn't a very strong competitive pressure to put more privacy in place. And this also extends to business model. And a good way to look at that is actually App Store policies. Today, Proton, as a subscription business, we actually pay 30% of our revenue on mobile to Google and Apple, actually our biggest competitors. And do you know what Facebook pays? Facebook pays $0. Why does Facebook pay $0? Because our model is subscriptions. So we owe Google and Apple 30% of revenue. Facebook makes money by monetizing your data, and they owe nothing. So if you're an app developer with the choice of building a mobile app, which is practically everybody now, you have a choice. I can give 30% of my money to the tech giants, or I can do advertising as a business model. And you can see how there's a very structural reason why advertising becomes a dominant business model online. And until we have competition rules like the Digital Markets Act that changes this, I think it's very difficult to disrupt the status quo.
There's a question here on consent, which I think is quite important. We touched on it earlier. What about change of consent over time? So meaning, how do you make sure that one can pull consent on some data points later, which one agreed earlier?
Yeah, I think it's very important to have regulation. We cannot say that, even though regulation is very difficult, we don't do it. It doesn't always work. It sometimes needs revision and modifications and amendments, but it's still better than a world without any regulation at all.
Right. Now, here in Europe, there's lots of debate over data sovereignty. And of course, the cloud. We can't talk about data without speaking about a sovereign cloud. The problem is that Europe is having trouble competing with American giants. I mean, we did have some examples of European clouds, but we still don't have like one very robust solution. What can Europe do to stay in that race?
It might be more treating the symptom than the disease. So I have looked at Sectum Cloud, actually. It's something that we looked into. And I can say if you look at the complexity of that framework, it's daunting for big companies for sure. But I suppose for startups, it's maybe practically impossible. So in a perverse way, what these regulations may end up doing is actually making the barriers higher for the small companies and making it easier for the big companies to have the resources to comply. So it may actually be counterintuitive. I think in the end, when it comes to sovereign cloud, the goal, of course, is to have more data based in Europe and not have Cloud Act problems that we have in the US. But the bigger goal behind that really is to have a tech industry in Europe that can compete and succeed. And sovereign cloud, it's better than nothing, but I don't think it's a real solution. I think what we really need to do is, level the playing field so that European companies can compete with American tech giants on a level ground, because the talent is here, the ambition is here, but the conditions are not quite here yet.
What are the ethical implications of companies collecting and analyzing personal data for commercial use? And shouldn't individuals have more power over that, over what's being done with their data? And also, we're in an interconnected world. How can we strike a balance, perhaps, between the need for data-driven innovation and at the same time preservation of privacy?
The ideal situation is businesses and consumer incentives are aligned. But in today's digital economy, we see the dominant business model, one that maybe doesn't always achieve that alignment. The way the internet economy works today, it's largely driven by ads. Ads is the biggest business out there. We talk about data minimization. It's very hard to run an ad business if you need to minimize data that you collect, because without data, you cannot actually target any of your ads. So there is an inherent conflict of interest there from a business model standpoint that I think makes it challenging to always align corporate interests, with individual interest. And I don't know the answer to this problem, right? Because there's no easy solution. If there was, we probably would have found it already. But that's the root of the challenge. It's an ethical issue, but fundamentally, it drills down to a business model issue.
Thank you for all of the questions that are coming in. This is great. We have, how can we force the companies to respect the rules when the person's personal data is actually the product that the company is selling to its clients?
If that's the case, which it often is, the company has a responsibility to maximize shareholder...
Disclose it.
To disclose it, but also their obligation here is to their shareholders and not to you, right? They're going to maximize revenue. So you can try to pressure companies, but ultimately, you as a consumer, you're actually the most powerful force in the market economy. The services you choose to give data to, the businesses you choose to support, the choices you make on which apps and services you use, this determines the future of our economy. And so it's not about forcing the companies, because you probably will not succeed, right? They will care about their revenue more than probably your own interests. But you yourself can practically take action and change this.
So change in the way you interact with those companies and decide to boycott them if needed?
Yeah, well, if you don't like some companies' privacy policies, don't use their services. And you can vote with your feet, with your wallet, with your behavior.
So we can't talk about privacy without touching on the cultural aspect. We said it a little bit earlier, but how do cultural attitudes towards privacy vary across different societies? And are there perhaps universal values that exist or standards that should be upheld? We did start talking about it, but maybe in greater depth.
Yeah, it's a very tricky issue to be universal. I can kind of tell a story. Many years ago, I was at an event in Nepal. This is with investigative journalists that use Proton that we're actively supporting out in the field. And the discussion about internet privacy came up. And the context was very different. What they told me was, yes, internet privacy, it's important, but actually we're still trying to get internet, right? And I think that's a very clear perspective that I think over time, the standards will converge. But it will take some regions and some countries probably a lot longer to get there. But eventually, it's a bit like environmental movement, right? The standards for clean air, they will eventually converge to clean air. But it may take China and these other countries several decades later to get there.
What would be, the takeaway of this roundtable? What would be the main message that you want people to remember about this theme of, does privacy still exist?
Privacy does exist if you want it to exist. So, as consumers, we're empowered. No one's going to build privacy for you. You're not going to have governments fixing the problem for you. Companies, will not do it for you. You need to be the ones to demand and push for the change. So, privacy in the 21st century, it exists if we want it to exist.
Looking ahead, how do you think that privacy will change with the advancement of other technologies? Will it further erode our privacy? How do you see things moving forward?
Well, the big theme of Viva Tech this year is AI. It's practically on every single panel in every single booth. And we do need to think a bit about, what does AI mean for privacy? And AI is dependent on data. Data to provide the answers, data for training the AI. So on the surface, the AI trend is probably not going to be overly positive for privacy. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that we can't do AI in a private way. And if I look at the advances in computing, today an AI chip that used to require a supercomputer to run, in a few years can actually run on a mobile device. So I do see a world where actually we can do more processing on device side, and that's a way to preserve more privacy because we can do more things on devices as opposed to on big server cloud farms. So Moore's law is a famous law that computing doubles every 18 months. That may be what saves us from AI and privacy.
Will privacy always come at a cost for the user? Example, paid Proton email account. Either you're paying or your data is the payment.
Well, I would say that you're paying either way, right? It depends on what you're paying with. Are you paying with your most sensitive, intimate, personal information, or are you paying with the cost of a coffee? But actually, I would also point out that 99% of Proton users use the service for free. It's a freemium business model, and businesses pay, power users pay, but it is possible from a unit economic standpoint to make it available broadly for free. Is it as profitable as other ways of making money online? Maybe not. But being eco-friendly also wasn't the most profitable way of doing things either. And we may decide as a society that privacy is more important.
Thank you all for all of the questions that you sent in throughout the conversation. Thank you to our three panelists. I think we can give them a warm round of applause.